Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have with us Savio P. Clement. He is a healthcare strategist, leadership strategist who studies how sustained pressure impacts executive decision making. So we'll learn about his adaptive resilience leadership framework and also about why high performers stall after pressure, how to avoid decision fatigue when pressure stays high, and the moment after the storm that most leaders are not prepared for. Welcome to the show, Savio.
Thank you, Kundania. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Welcome to the show once again, Savio. So we'll welcome to India in this online form, Savio. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people, a lot of leaders across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll talk about leadership after crisis. What happens after the crisis is over? We'll talk about this and much more. But before that, let's talk a bit about your journey, your background, your story, so that the audience knows who they are listening to.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a keynote and TEDx speaker. I'm also a board certified health and wellness coach, a journalist who've interviewed now over 2,000 thought leaders, change makers, and celebrities as well. I'm also a best-selling author, and unfortunately and fortunately, I have a title of two-time cancer survivor. I was in remission for a decade, and then June of 2024, I had a relapse. And fortunately, through 16 months of treatment, including a stem cell transplant, I received a complete response to treatment. So I am in remission again.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Savio, talking of leadership, and crisis. Why do you focus on leadership crisis, especially after the crisis and then leadership? Normally, people talk about before everything happens because that's a lot profitable for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my lived experience, as I mentioned, showed me the way to deal with crisis. And a lot of people feel that they just have to manage the crisis, that the crisis itself is something to fix, something to manage. And of course, that's very important. But what I deal with is what happens after the crisis. And in my lane, which I work with healthcare leaders, they have to regain clarity and make high stakes decisions after disruption because the pressure hasn't gone, it's just gone internal. And that's where performance is either won or lost. And most of the time, that's when individuals kind of lose their way because it's only after the crisis that you have the opportunity to recalibrate, to not only figure out a new normal, but also a new way forward. And so for me, it gives me most joy, not only from my professional experience, but also my lived experience of knowing what it is, especially in the healthcare industry, to have not only wellness as a component of living well, but also a ways and means to actually figure out for yourself, how do I reclaim what was lost? How do I find my way through the discomfort?
Absolutely. So when you talk about crisis, people know about crisis, but I want to understand what type of crisis that you are talking about for leaders.
Yeah. So for myself, obviously, it's a very dramatic crisis. It's a medical crisis, but this could be a business insolvency. This could be something that happens in their own personal life, whether that is business loss or marriage. And so when I deal with leaders and talk to them, I really speak with healthcare leaders who have very high stakes. Not only are they worrying and caring for themselves and for their organization, but they also have another human being, and that is really high stakes. And for the most of the time, it really feels like they themselves don't have the wherewithal to move forward because they either are caught up in their roles or in what they feel like they need to exemplify to the world. And so for the most part, they also feel like they have cognitive load and that cognitive pressure that comes with it. And so they just can't seem to find their way through the maze. And so for me, it's very important to actually speak on this topic because a lot of times people think that when the crisis hits and you fix the crisis, that your problems are all solved. and it's really not. So crisis can be in any situation, whether it's personal or professional. In my case, when I speak on keynote stages, it's really about the personal aspect of how does a business recalibrate and figure out for themselves what it is that they need to do better that they didn't do when the crisis hit.
Absolutely. So normally people think, especially for leaders, if the crisis is over, it's time to celebrate. You talk about, that no, it's something to reassess things. Do leaders
Absolutely.
also think that way, or is it that they also are busy in celebrating? Because it's a tough time for a lot of leaders. But then with all the leadership itself is in crisis. A lot of people have questions about the efficiency of leaders themselves. But that's not the point right now. It's about after the crisis. Help us understand, how do the leaders that you talk to, do they feel relieved after the crisis, or is it when their work actually begins?
So it's a great point. And obviously, I'm not trying to say don't celebrate when you overcome a crisis. Of course, celebrate. Leadership should celebrate all the people involved in creating that success story. But what ends up happening is there starts happening a drift, or a gap starts happening. And that gap is what then enlarges and becomes so much bigger that they themselves can't see the forest from the trees. And for the most part, I think it behooves us, and I speak a lot about this idea of self-regulation. A lot of times when you are in the crisis, you have to figure out and regulate yourself. But actually, it's only after the crisis that you have to actually find new principles, new modes. You have to find your North Star again. You have to really allow individuals within your organization to actually feel like they're part of the discussion. Because at the end of the day, Kundari, what is leadership? Leadership is who you want to emulate, who you want to follow, who do you want to mirror. And if the leaders themselves don't embody that specifically, then they themselves can't lead effectively, because they themselves, like I said, cling to their roles, cling to their titles, and they find themselves lost, creating this chasm, this drift, this shift that is not really sustainable in the long run.
Absolutely. So how do leaders know whether they are still, in that crisis mode or survival mode, and that it is time to reassess? Will you tell them? Do you tell them, or they can also figure it out for themselves? Some people will be able to talk to you, but a lot of people will only be able to hear this particular episode. How do they assess for themselves, Savio?
Yeah. So I speak about this on my stages and also in my TEDx talk, and also in my journalism work. Right now, I'm currently running a series with CEOs and CMOs on the healthcare leadership operating system. And so basically, I have a framework which is called the Adaptive Resilience Framework. And in that framework is that most leaders wait until they're overwhelmed, but this framework helps identify the stress signals, the patterns, to help them convert that particular indecision into clarity. It's really allowing them to turn that adversity into a gold or some form of wisdom, so that they can then latch onto and have their teams latch onto. It's very important that leaders, they themselves check in with themselves. And this is something I echo in my TEDx talk. I did a TEDx talk. So I mentioned that I had a relapse after being a decade in remission of cancer, which is a blood cancer, lymphoma. And I did a TEDx talk about a year and a half, about 2 years before, and it was entitled 7 Minutes to Wellness, How to Love Your Inner Stranger. And in it, people were like, what are you talking about, inner stranger? And they said, well, what's your inner stranger? And I'm like, well, the inner stranger for me was that young adult who never really felt grounded. I never really felt attached, or I felt like I belonged per se. And then the person was like, oh, I get it. For me, the inner stranger is that idealized professional that I want to be, or that great mother, or that great sibling that I want to be, that I just can't seem to reach. And so in the TEDx talk, I mentioned a framework called the Aloha Reboot. And in it, aloha is an expression in Hawaiian, means hello. So it just means hello to your inner self. And so it's an acronym. So A stands for acknowledge. So acknowledge where you are. Don't pretend. Actually do a word vomit or a situation vomit and actually figure out for yourself what's actually happening. L stands for listening. So listen into your inner self. In Hawaiian, there's a healing modality called Huna healing. And in Huna healing, they actually believe that the body has not only sensations, but it actually sends you messages. There's wisdom, there's consciousness there, there's language there. It might not talk to you, but it has information for you to glean. O stands for opening. So open yourself up to this information. Whatever your belief system is, you're only really exploring the self and the body. H stands for harnessing. So harness this information, make the mental connections, see what works, what doesn't work. And A stands for acting. But I often tell people that there's a caveat with acting. You have to have courage to act, because a lot of the research and not a lot of the actual validated information points to the fact that when it comes to change, it's not that people don't want to change. It's that people don't know how to change. There is a model called the trans-theoretical model of change, which is the stages of change. And it posits that at the end of the day, people don't know if they're in pre-contemplation, if they're thinking about change, if they're actually making change, if they are in change, but they're thinking of relapsing. And so I often say when it comes to that A, the acting, you have to really figure out and have the courage to move forward.
Right. How do you help such leaders, Savio, when they come to you? Or can you spot a leader like that whenever you talk to them?
Absolutely. So the first thing is, like I mentioned, is self-regulation. So for example, I was in the hospital with a stem cell transplant, 29 days in the hospital. I lost 26 pounds. Every 4 hours, nurses would come and check my vitals. The doctors would do their rounds. I only had two anchors. I had stillness and silence. And no matter what religion or belief system, even if you don't even believe in anything, you have access to silence and stillness. And in that, I realized something really powerful. I realized this idea of not only self-regulating myself, because at the end of the day, I can't control my red blood cell count, my platelets, my white blood cells count, all the markers that the doctors wanted. I can't control that. What I could control and I could regulate is my emotions. I could be there for the doctors because they're actually working in tandem with me to heal me. It's not that they're only healing me, I'm healing myself as well. So we have to work together in order to do that. I also decided to reframe. So instead of chemo as a poison and something toxic, I saw it as an elixir. They call it mana from the universe, life force from the universe, something. And I allowed and surrendered and submitted to that healing there. So that's number one. Number two, I also created something called psychological distancing. So in other words, I created a little buffer, a space between the Savio that was in disease, that was in the hospital, and this other part of me that was still alive. My mental acuity was still alive. My spirit was still alive. My emotions were still there. And so I allowed myself to have just that space to figure it out. And then two other things that were really powerful as well is I actually, instead of, most people think resilience is just bouncing back, but in it, I call it adaptive resilience, is that when you're in the SHIT, when you're in that mess, how do you remain flexible? How do you remain open? How do you make the mental connections or the strategies or figure out for yourself, how do I move forward, accept what's happening to me, but also allow myself to see something greater than myself? And lastly, and this is a little controversial, is that we were all taught this idea of having intelligence was the number one trait to have. Then we were taught emotional intelligences. But actually, the research and the information points to this idea of metacognition. It's the thinking of the thinking. So when I was in silence and stillness, I was like, who is this Savio that's actually in this hospital room? And who is something above that? What is the thinking and the buffer between the two? And so those are the strategies that I know that I look for in leaders who are not regulating properly. And then the question is, how do you regulate properly? For me, it's meditation. I've been meditating for over 20 years. First, I started off with 1 minute. Now it's 20 minutes. But it could be prayer. It could be journaling. It could be walking in silence. It could be breathing exercises. Whatever works for people. It's the first thing I see is when a leader, they themselves are not able to actually be objective with the situation and they're always subjective. That's when I know the trigger point needs to be readdressed.
Absolutely. What about motivation, Savio? Especially in life, in a situation like yours. One is that, talked about metacognition. That is also, a lot of people are nowadays talking about that. We'll talk to that about in terms of leaders. But in your case, what was the motivation to fight back and look at just living? Is that motivation enough? I want to understand that from you. And
Absolutely.
vis-a-vis leaders, what should be their motivation after the crisis? Because most of the times we have to be very, open about it, candid about it. A lot of leaders just think about top line, bottom line, and bank account and all those things. I want to understand the importance of motivation in your life, as well as the leaders life who are facing crisis or have just faced a crisis.
Yeah. So motivation for me was very simple. Like I was a very introspective child. I was a very aware, self-aware young adult. I grew up Catholic in a Catholic household, but in college, I knew that I had to explore other belief systems or other ways of thinking. And so from that point to now, I've explored everything from Buddhism to Jewish mysticism, all the way down to Vedic philosophy. And so for me, my motivation, I've never really been afraid to die per se. Cancer takes out a lot of people. When I got my relapse in June of 2024, I lost from that point till now about 8 individuals from cancer. Some of them was just their first battle. And so for me, I was never really afraid to die. I was afraid, the motivation came, I was afraid that I wasn't living to my potential, that whatever the quote unquote assignment was, I didn't fulfill it. And I had to accept the fact that maybe this was it. And so for me, the motivation was, I want to still live. I want to still talk. I want to still do. I want to still give. I want to still appreciate. I want to do all those things. And it's not always a numbers situation. Now, when it comes to professional leanings, obviously people have to answer to their team, their organization, the boards. There's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of high stakes. So I think when it comes to leaders in general, I often find when I'm coaching, when I'm speaking to them, when I'm actually even interviewing them, that most of the time their motivation is strictly a numbers game. It's about trying to figure out how to move forward and figure out the return on investment, figure out how to actually create more abundance in that realm. But the deeper motivation, and motivation is a very tricky word, because even for speakers like myself, they often say that you can be a motivational speaker and that's wonderful, and the applause is great in the moment, but it's not self-sustaining. It just doesn't last too long. So motivation is very tricky. But in general, for leaders, the motivation really should be about, what can I actually give in a situation, rather than what can I actually take in a situation. They often say, and it's actually true, that for the most part, when you see something, it's really about chipping away and making it more simpler rather than more complex and more weighty. So I would say, just to pin this whole conversation regarding motivation, I think it always starts from the internal. When you look at external ways to make you happy or to figure out problems, it never really allows you to really figure out the full extent of what can actually be done.
Absolutely. So one more question then, Savio, is that if Savio can have this metacognition, understanding himself in real time, why can't leaders who are supposed to be from brilliant business schools, brilliant backgrounds, earning brilliant salaries, brilliant bank accounts, why can't they have a bit of metacognition in their own life, even before the crisis and especially after the crisis?
Yeah. Well, before and after the crisis is still really the same thing. There's a problem. I think for the most part, it's because people don't give themselves that pause. There's power in the pause. For me, life just gave me that pause. I call it a spiritual exile, an exile of some kind. 29 days in a quarantine room, attached to machines. Every 4 hours, people came. And I think for the most part, people are always trying to figure out what's next, rather than actually being present and authentic with actually what's happening. And that requires vulnerability. That requires the ability to be okay with discomfort. That requires the ability to see yourself besides the role or the title that you are working towards. I think at the end of the day, it really behooves us, especially in a world of disruption, politically, socially, and also technologically with AI, that we actually come back to what's more important, is our actual connections with another human being, rather than always trying to figure out what content do I put out, what are the numbers that I need to hit, what are the things that I need to do externally. We should always really come to the sense that we ourselves are generating those things in our lives, rather than actually trying to figure out for ourselves, how do I get something from the external world?
Absolutely, absolutely. What about decision making? You talk about it getting impacted. Why does it get impacted? Leaders are supposed to lead where whatever they are leading, especially business leaders. They are supposed to lead. They are efficient people. They have got the training that they needed in business schools and other places, and that is why they are the leaders. If a leader cannot have a good decision making power, then what makes them the leader in the first place? I want to understand then, how do leaders keep the right kind of decision making power in spite or despite of the crisis? What is your take on this?
Sure. So the decision making is really difficult because, like you said, leaders are trained not only in their quote unquote education and training, but also in the day to day. They have to make those decisions. But oftentimes, and I can speak from my own experience, there is that cognitive overload, that pressure that you have to actually maintain the information, the data, all the metrics, all the information and that's just not feasible at any given time. So what you need to do is you need to actually not only simplify things, but take things off of your plate per se. In other words, not only delegate and delineate the information or the tasks that need to be done in a given day, but also not feel like you yourself have to solve everything. And that's really where decision making complex happens, because oftentimes when it comes to decision making, it's always about figuring out what's actually happening from the top level, rather than figuring out what's actually needs to be fixed from the middle level or even the bottom level. You always want to actually make things so much faster and quicker and better that they themselves don't figure out for themselves, well, what is it that actually caused those things to break? What is it that actually caused us to not reach those specific problems and creates the bottleneck that happens?
Absolutely. Now about identity and about, in terms of values, resetting your life. In your case, twice, one was very recent. One starts looking at life differently, perhaps. How did your challenges, your crisis impact you in terms of resetting, relooking at identity, relooking at the world and the purpose that you are here? How does it impact leaders after the crisis? Or is it that the crisis is over and I can take another big chance at a bigger salary and a better life, quality of life? Forget about everything else. Forget about employees. Forget about the climate. Forget about the planet. Forget about everyone else. Let's fire some more employees. How should they look at, how did you look at, what is it that you seek for yourself now? How is it that leaders can decide about what they should seek after crisis?
Yeah. So I think any situation, like I said, mine was dramatic. It's a medical situation, but it could be anything, business, personal, whatever the case may be. It's really about perspective. And I know for me, I live in the middle ground of both attachment and detachment. I don't favor one or the other. I do what I need to do on a daily basis. And at some point, I just let go and I don't get fixated on it. When it comes to leadership, especially when other people are vying for your attention, for your decision making, for your actions, they themselves often find that they're pulled in many different directions. And that's where, to a large degree, they themselves lose their identity because they themselves figure out for themselves, well, this is not really fulfilling me, or this is not actually something that I'm actually enjoying in the moment. And for the most part, I think what the saddest thing is that then they use other means, external means, in order to placate or in order to make that situation feel not as stressful or not as hard or difficult. But really, the challenge, even for myself, is really figure out for yourself, who are you beyond the identity? Who are you beyond the role that you are professing, especially in a business setting? And also figure out for yourself, how do I create a more present and more authentic type of leadership that others can actually feel like we have an actual session, we actually align with a lot. In coaching, we talk a lot about this idea of vision. Vision is not a goal. A goal are select points that you need to reach. A vision is actually how you want to feel, how you want to be, who is it that you want to reclaim. And identity has a large portion to do with that aspect, because identity really then falls into this idea of legacy. And to a large degree, I know I thought about a lot of that because I was dealing with a huge and very challenging medical situation.
Absolutely, absolutely, Savio. There is so much to learn about leadership. There is so much to learn about crisis. There is so much to learn about, leadership after crisis. And I'm sure a lot of people would want to connect with you, learn more from you, about your framework. What's the best way for them to do so?
Sure. They can go to my website, saviopclemente.com, SAVIOPCLEMENTE. On there, I have my keynote work. I have my TEDx talk. I have my book, my coaching. Every Wednesday on Substack, I have a newsletter where I talk about the head, heart, and gut intelligence, which I call the three brains. And also, like I mentioned, I'm running a interview series with CEOs and CMOs on the healthcare leadership operating system. And then if they want to follow me on social media, I'm at every platform at The Human Resolve. And that's because I believe, what else do we have except resolution and resolve in our lives?
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.